you're not responding in a Christian way, and so I'm going to ignore everything that you have to say. When in fact we can't hold a non-Christian movement up to a Christian standard and say, hey, you're not responding to pain the way that I think you should respond to pain, so I'm just going to ignore everything that you have to say. And so I think that can be something that we would lean towards as Christians, when we think, no, we should be responding, we hear turn the other cheek and be peaceful, which is biblical and that's true, but I think we have to give people grace and for where they're at. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, to touch on the response thing, I've seen it a few times and shared it a little bit. Just this really good analogy that I've seen, like a story of like a mother and her child.
Mm-hmm.
And so like when you see a mother caring for their child and the child's complaining or whining or being destructive, right? Like kids often do sometimes when they're not getting what they want. Like the mother doesn't respond with like harsh words or like discipline to a point that's like harmful, right? Like, or doesn't like disregard the situation like Brianna was talking about just out of hand because they're responding in a way that's irresponsible. But you respond to them in a way that's loving and caring and recognizing where the response is coming from, like you were talking about, right? Like, so like a mother doesn't just dismiss a child, but they seek to learn like what is causing the issue, why they're responding the way that they are. And so, yeah, talking about like the root of the response of the Black Lives Matter movement, I think is really important.
Yeah, and I think what makes this even harder then is that there's so many different experiences when it comes to it, right?
Yeah.
And so when you try and get to, okay, what is this root issue? People have so many different perspectives of the root issue itself, which is racism or prejudice. And so you'll have some people who think, hey, no, racism, prejudice, that's not an issue that we face in America anymore. Yeah. So you'll have that side of things, and then all the way on the other, you'll have someone who's very hurt and extremely angry because they've experienced it firsthand, and their family has, and for generations they have, and it looks different. And so I think it's hard when you start having these different perspectives all on the same issue, even if you start boiling things down. But I think you kind of always have to go back to, hey, is the person in front of me in pain?
Exactly.
And if they are, how should I respond to that? And even if I don't understand it, and I heard this analogy of someone. They said, a woman who's giving birth, she's in a lot of pain. And you would never tell a woman who's in labor, hey, stop screaming, or stop moaning so much, because you're making me uncomfortable. You wouldn't tell her to stop gripping on the sides of the bed when she's giving birth, because she's in pain, right? And so in the same way, when you have people who, one, aren't Christian, but two, are experiencing a pain that we may or may not understand, we can't look at them and say, hey, I need you to be quiet, first off. Just tone it down. You're at a 10, bring it down to a 5. Justify your pain to me, and then maybe I'll show you compassion. And we don't really get that choice as Christians. We show compassion in every circumstance. And so it's not condoning everything. I want you guys to hear me. And it's not saying, oh, anyone can respond to anything any type of way that they want to. That's not what I'm saying. My point is we have to be compassionate as Christians. And sometimes that looks like not holding on to our own opinions. Yeah. And so I think what's hard about this whole topic is there's so many opinions, and we're trying to sift through to truth and what the Lord says. And so going back to just constantly, I'm constantly asking God, like, God, what is an opinion of mine, and then what's truth? Because I want to hold on to truth, and I want to keep my opinions in open hand. And I think that's really important.
I love just talking about the justification piece of it, because like it has never and will never be our job to find justification for like somebody else's pain, right? Like you're saying, if we're talking about how we respond as Christians to the movement, like you're saying, it's with grace and with love and compassion. And like obviously we don't like condone things that we see that aren't Christ-like, but as a response to the pain, like you can't respond to somebody who's in pain, or like what I've talked about with people a lot of the times, like if you put someone in pain, like you're not allowed to tell somebody that you didn't hurt them, right?
Yeah.
Like if they're in pain, they're in pain, and our response to that is, how do I love you through that? Like, how do we figure that out together? And not, like you said, like justify it to me before I act on it, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. So off of that, how do we have conversations with people about this topic, whether that's friends or family, or just how to handle harder conversations and knowing that there might be conflict?
I think a big piece, like you were talking about, is just the perspectives. Like there's just so many different angles that people are coming at this with. And I think something that is going to be on you guys and your responsibility is to figure out where you're at, like what your perspective is. And that's not going to be like definitive, like we've talked about with a bunch of other things. Like that's going to be evolving and changing all the time. Like, and the two of us and everybody, even older people and people who have been at work with this for like decades, are always learning, always like developing a different mindset. But you guys are coming to a point where like you're gonna have to do like the research on your own, and not for just for this topic, but just like do research on your own and figure out what you believe about something. Just like your faith, right? Like you're developing a personal connection and a personal like knowledge base or belief system of what you're living out of, right? And so the same thing I think applies to this, and how we have conversations is like know where you're at with this. First of all, like learn for yourself, do some research on articles, talk to people like your friends, and talk to like Black people that you know, and leaders like in that community, and figure out what your perspective on it is, because I think before you can have like a good conversation, at least for like advocacy, like with somebody else, you got to know where you stand. And so we're not, and again, like to reiterate what Megan said, like we're not up here telling you to believe what we believe, or like just to take this as like gospel truth or whatever, right? Like there's such a big responsibility in being intentional about learning what it looks like for you, and then going and having conversations with that. And also another big piece is just being willing to be corrected and to learn, right? At least for, that's been a big thing for me, and what it will be for a lot of you guys too, because we're white especially, is that like we're coming from a perspective that we don't know as much about this, and we haven't felt like the pain or things that Black people have gone through, as far as what they're fighting against right now. And so it's really important for us to be able to learn and to be flexible and to be able to be receptive to things that people are telling us. And again, like not taking everything as like hard truth right away, but like you have to be open and be willing to receive things, and let that change you, and not be like stubborn and stuck in what you believe or maybe didn't believe, you know?
So like how many of you guys have like had conversations about everything that's been going on, either like with family or friends, like maybe a little, if you haven't, that's fine, but has it been uncomfortable, or has it been like, oh no, it's like it's fine, a little bit, like what do you guys think? On a level to like 1 being no, this is totally fine, to 10 being, oh my gosh, this was so uncomfortable and I was really nervous the whole time. Where would you guys say you were at? Let's put like a number up with your hands. 3, a little bit higher. So it's like a range, right? Yeah. And so I would say it's uncomfortable for a lot of people. And I think what helps me a lot with this is understanding why you're having a conversation about race and social injustice in the first place. And I think, at least for me, when I'm having these conversations, it's within the context of the hope for change. And so I think a lot of times when we have conversations, maybe with someone who doesn't look like us or someone who has a different viewpoint than us, we get so nervous about either 1, messing up, it's like saying the wrong thing, or like potentially getting labeled as something that would be terrible. And I think what really helps, particularly as Christians, is we model, okay, we're going to model what it looks like to have grace when we're having conversations like this for someone else, for the other person who's there. And so what do I mean by that? It looks like that people are going to stumble through this, because if we had the perfect model for what a conversation like this looked like, if we had the perfect model for how we're supposed to move forward, we probably wouldn't be in this situation in the first place, right? And so if Brendan says something that really frustrates me and like I'm like, I don't agree with that at all, I'm going to have grace for him in the process. And then vice versa. If I say something that he's like, whoa, Brie, like what in the world are you talking about? He's going to have grace for me in the process of that. And we can't, have you guys seen like celebrities? They'll have said something like 10 years ago, and then the media will pull it up, be like, you said this 10 years ago, like how could you need to apologize right now? Like, and they'll get stripped of their like advertising, or they get stripped of different sponsors or whatever it is, or different titles. And I think that is such a negative way of how people that kind of sets us up for failure, because then we're so afraid to say anything that we won't say anything at all, because we're so afraid of messing up. And so when we're having conversations like this, you really have to say, okay, I'm going to have grace for the person in front of me, because we're having this conversation for the hope for change. So 6 months from now, if I don't have a different viewpoint from this conversation, I'm probably not doing my job right. And I'm not, the purpose of these conversations aren't even happening. Does that make sense?
Yep.
You guys following a little bit? All right. Yeah.
Thanks, God. You guys already kind of touched on this, but as we were talking about it, this was a question I think it's really important too, that goes at a broader spectrum of just like having compassion for people, is how do you believe Jesus did and does respond to pain?
Yeah, I mean, I think like we were talking about, like Jesus was always a person who met people where they were at, right? And he never sought to like see them for anything else other than what they were like in as a person in the moment. And so I think that, I mean, obviously our job always is to model Jesus' behavior in our interactions and in our lives. And so I think first and foremost, like we were saying, like the biggest thing is just to meet people where they're at, and not to like compromise ourselves or anything like we've been talking about either. Like when we do that, and when we engage with people like that, not to compromise what we believe or what we should be advocating for, but in a way that like you're never going to reach somebody and have an effective conversation, like you were saying, if you can't understand where they're coming from, right?
Or if you don't try.
Exactly, right. Like if you don't try and reach them, if you don't try to understand, and also if you don't show them that you're a person worth trusting and worth talking with, you know, right? Like if you're going to people and immediately condemning or immediately forcing them to justify, like you're not going to be a person that they're gonna look to and say, oh, I can have a healthy, trusting conversation with this person. And so I think it's just so important to first of all like develop a way that we can engage people in a way that Jesus would do, in a compassionate way that develops that trusting link between you and that person that allows you to even like start a conversation with them.
I for one of the workshops that I developed helped develop for my job on conflict resolution, one of the aspects of it was looking around developing trust, and what does that look like, and how do you do that? And sometimes people will think that in order to really build trust, or to be on the same page as someone, you have to adopt their mindset, and you have to adopt their opinions, and you have to like believe the same things. But research actually shows it's not about agreeing like 100% with the person and what they say, but it's grappling with their perspective. And so it's not even like, we don't even have to end up in the same spot, but I have to grapple with what you're bringing to the table and what you're laying in front of me. So that means like, and by grappling, I mean you have to wrestle with it and just not totally throw it out like, oh, that's ridiculous, right? So taking time to understand it, and that's really what builds trust. And I think that's the foundation of any type of conversation like this. But the way that Jesus dealt with pain so much, like, I love that he constantly did stuff that was really out of the box all the time. And if you really look at God, like when you look at his life, Jesus was this offensive guy. Like, have you guys ever thought about that? He was so offensive to the people at his time. And so when you look at the Pharisees and some of these other religious leaders, he was constantly, like, his words were basically like punching them in the face and pushing them so outside of their comfort zones. And he did that because he specifically sought after people who were in pain and like people who were rejected. He's like, no, these are the people who I want to sit at my table. These are the ones who I'm going to spend time with. And so I just thought, you know, when we're thinking about how did God respond? How does he do, like, how did Jesus respond to pain, or how did he show compassion when he was here on earth as a man? I think a lot of times it goes back to just kind of making sure, one, that we're not being super offended all the time. Like, you know, like because we could be offended at something that God's doing, and that would be unfortunate if we find ourselves in that situation. But also, I think something else that he did was he wasn't like stuck in the narrative of the current political aspect. So like during Jesus' time, there was a lot of racial issues that were going on. If you just kind of like look at some of the different groups, like, oh no, we don't, like the woman at the well, like we don't even talk to these people over here. Or so there was a lot. If you could look down and kind of study at some of the things, it was kind of similar to what we see right now, and it's nothing new.
Right.
But I think he constantly was just meeting people where they were at, and like doing it in a way that was giving them dignity, I guess.
Yeah. And to touch on, I think something important that you mentioned about Jesus being an offensive person, right? Like, it's something that at least I didn't think about until, honestly, I started thinking about these issues and just like social justice in general. Because like, I think we grow up, at least I did, like in the church, just being like, be kind to everyone, and be compassionate, and just try to be agreeable, I think, is like what I got.
Which is a dangerous spot to be in, right?
Like,
trying to be agreeable.
Like, exactly, because then you get content, and other people get content, and you're just like sitting back and watching. But I think part of being kind and responding to pain is like, in lifting those people up who are in pain like Jesus did, like you're gonna upset some other people, right? And we have to be okay with that, which is a scary thing for some of us, right? It's like at the expense of somebody else's comfortability, like acting like Jesus in love and picking up someone else who's in pain. And that's not to say that we're dismissing those other people who are offended by what we're doing, because then we get to have those conversations with them, right, and grapple with what they're saying and everything like that. But I think a big thing that, at least a shift in my mindset that had to happen, was like, I have to be okay with offending somebody else by living the way that I think Jesus is calling me to.
Which is so hard for some of us. Like, that's really hard for me. And I think throughout the past year or so, I've been, okay, how do I get comfortable with the sound of my own voice and just sticking with it? And what does that look like? What does it sound like? And what I mean by that is people who I love and respect and cherish may have a different opinion than me, and I have to be okay with still sharing my own, even if it doesn't necessarily align with theirs. And as Christians, then, you know, one thing that I heard, so that, because that can be scary, because then you'll think, oh my gosh, will they reject me? Will there be a break in the relationship? But the hope and what we should be modeling is, what does, again, compassion and grace look like in that moment? And so as Christians, when we have relationship established, we don't have the right to walk away then when we're offended, and we don't have the right to hold on to offense. Like, someone can offend you, but you're the one who gives the power. You're the one who has the power to give, or you have, it comes down to you to give power to that offense or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah, right.
So, yeah.
Wow, so much good stuff. My question is just like, how do we shift our mindsets or ways of thinking about this? But that also pertains to where we are on the spectrum of, you know, what we believe in stuff. So maybe you can just share like things that you guys are doing as far as like continuing to learn and grow and process, and what you would say for advice for, you know, the youth.
So one thing that I actually want to say, like, and I want you guys to be careful and like be proactive when you are if you decide to like do research on something like this and try and broaden your perspective, because there are so many different perspectives out there. I remember when I was in college, and this was like at the height of the election when Trump was getting elected, and you really saw the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I remember, but there was also, I don't know if you guys remember, but in the media there was a lot of highlighted like racial issues, and so there was a lot of like there's just a lot of racial issues that were being highlighted in the media. And I remember as college students, there was this class that I was taking. I loved the class, loved the professor. It was African American history course, and some of the students were asking the professor, like, hey, like, what do we do? Like, how do we respond? Kind of like what we're doing right now. It's like, how do we respond to this? And his answer was, you have to let your anger fuel you to see change, which isn't a good answer. Like, as Christians, we're not supposed to be rooted in anger. We're supposed to be rooted in love. And so you're gonna hear a lot of different perspectives, and you're gonna hear a lot of people who are coming from various walks of life. And so, like, as you do start to broaden the resources that you go after, even if it's just conversations with friends and people that you love, you just have to always go back to, what does the word of the Lord say? Like, what does the Bible say about this? Does it line up with it? And if it doesn't, okay, I have another perspective that I'm aware of, but doesn't mean I'm going to adopt it as my own. Does that make sense? Because there's going to be so much out there, guys. And I think as you are developing your own understanding, as you're going off to college, or if you're going into a different grade, whether it's 8th grade or high school, whatever, I think it's really important that you start to find your own voice in this. But in the middle of it, make sure that, okay, what does the Bible say about this perspective? Oh, that's an interesting perspective. What does the Bible say about it? And constantly going back to that as your foundation of truth.
And I think, like, a lot of things you're talking about is what we're talking about with this being just such a complex thing to learn about and deal with, because we're always coming back to the word and basing out of that, and then we go back to talking about, okay, but then we can't like condemn this movement because it's not a Christian movement based off of like Christian standards, right? So, but in finding your own voice, like, there's so many. I will say that, like, as crazy as things are, and I'm sure you guys have realized, like, there has undoubtedly been just like a resurgence, I guess, of like just information about ways that you can learn about things that have gone on in like the history of our country, what's going on currently, and people who are going to help you develop an opinion. And so, like Bri was saying, just be like super careful, and I think putting other people's opinions along like what the Word of God is saying. But like, if you like to read, there's a million books that you can read about racial reconciliation, about like mass incarceration, about like the war on drugs, about the history of like housing and everything, just like how everything got developed in our country.
And he just threw a lot of you guys.
Yeah, sorry. That's a lot of words.
But basically, like, what he's talking about is like, okay, so how has the history and like the structures of the United States influence where we are now?
Right.
And so even though we may not see like specific laws that are, hey, it's okay to drink from different water fountains, or we don't see that anymore, but how has the structures in place affected where we are now? And so that's what he was referencing.
Yes, thank you for touching on that. Not just throwing out random terms. But
really smart.
what I was getting at is like, if you like to read, there are books you can read. If you're like on social media a lot, there are like, I've seen a bunch of seminars from churches and from leaders in the Black community talking about the issue and what's going on. Like on Facebook, on social media, like there's documentaries on Netflix, there's a lot of different things that you guys can be doing. So don't think that like you can't access it in a way that you feel comfortable. Like, I don't really love reading. I've read a few books, but like I'll watch documentaries or like videos. Like, one of my good friends is a pastor at a church in Harrisburg, and he has like weekly talks with people about it and things. So like I'll watch those and learn, and you might even get the opportunity to learn about it at school, like is where I started. Like I didn't even know anything about like social justice issues and stuff like that, but I went to Messiah and took a class about it, and we read, like, it was like mandatory reading, so it wasn't even like I was choosing to do it, but there are going to be so many different ways that you guys can get information and start to learn, and like Bree said, like develop your own voice.
Yeah, and a lot of times like our circle of friends, they think really similarly to us, and they kind of hold like similar opinions. So it can be hard to just say like, oh, hey, go talk to someone who has a different opinion than you, or go talk to someone who doesn't look like you, because we tend to flock towards people who look like us and who think like us. But if the only conversations that you're having are with people who you could fully agree with, you're not really broadening your perspective. You're not really expanding what's out there. And so, I would say like try and figure out, and it would look different, you know, for where you guys are at. Like sometimes I would say like my first experience of getting a lot of interaction with a lot of different people who didn't look like me was at college. And so like you literally just may not be in a scenario where you could just easily meet a lot of different people, but then going back to like books or different documentaries or TV shows would really help with that. So
Also, if you guys need recommendations, I have a long list, so I can help you out.
So coming to our last question, and then if you guys have any questions, like what advice would you give for obviously these guys on how to learn and grow with this topic, with this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think just touching on a lot of the things that we've revisited, but just like, I think the biggest thing is just being willing to learn and being willing to develop and be wrong. And like we talked about earlier.
Which is hard.
Exactly.
Who
It's
wants
so
to be
hard.
wrong? Like I don't want to be wrong.
We were just talking about failure in the last one, right? And it's like Bree was saying, like you don't get to this one singular point of success, or in this case like knowledge, without like coming along this whole track and like stopping here and here and being like, oh shoot, what I thought about that I don't think necessarily is true anymore. Which is such a weird thing to figure out, because like you're spending your whole life being developed by other people and by the culture that you're around, and like you said, like we become who we are based off of like what we learn from and where we grow up, right? And so you're developing this person as to who you are, and so to start learning about new things and finding out, oh, maybe this part of me that I believed isn't necessarily true, it's tough, because it kind of hits at a piece of who you are as a person, and like you're saying, like nobody wants that. But being able to take that and be like, okay, maybe this isn't true. How do I get to a spot where now I act more like Jesus in this scenario is such an important thing. And I think it's like the biggest way to grow is just being willing to learn and being willing to fail and be wrong and go from there.
Yeah, you nailed it. So it just looks like humility, essentially.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yep.